Good morning, Wabash. Speaking today at Pioneer Chapel will be Dr. Rick Warner with his talk titled Wabash in War and Peace. Dr. Rick Warner is in his 24th year of teaching at Wabash College. He offers courses in Latin American, African, U.S., and world history, often with an emphasis on food history. Professionally, he has served as vice president and president of the World History Association and served for many years on the National Test Committee for the Advanced Placement College Board Test on World History. Prior to becoming a professor, Dr. Warner earned his living as a professional chef and publisher, tavern owner in California. He has been an honorary Sphinx Club member for over 15 years and has served as the club's advisor for the past couple of years. Dr. Warner also has served at one time, and in many cases at present, in advising capacity to Barbecue Club, La Alianza, Phi Delta Theta, the War Council, and the Cooking Club. Dr. Warner is an honorary Wabash alumnus of the class of 2013. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Warner.
Hey, thanks, guys. It's good to see a few people still left on campus today. It's all good. So I didn't have a lot of time to prepare for this. If you know, you know. And so what I decided to do is actually go back to one that I've already given, which I really liked a lot. And I'm pretty sure that nobody in the room, well, maybe almost nobody in the room has heard this before, because it was given on February 20th, 2003. So, which I think a lot of you were either not born or else just a baby at that point. So, in looking over it, I got to say that it's a lot more like a primary source historical document. In other words, you got to put your head into what somebody might have been saying and thinking in 2003, and how I love history, how you can see, like, you know, things are changed, or maybe they haven't, right? A lot of the same questions are happening, right? That's why studying history is so important. So if you're going to hear things that you know you may not be familiar to. So it's like reading the primary source. So there you go. So thank you to the Sphinx Club, especially to Seamus Boyce and Scott Metzger. So, you know, for the invitation to speak today. It's an honor to stand here having heard the good words of Drs. Plaker, Frederick, and Dean Bambry over the last 3 weeks. I commend the Sphinx Club for reigniting this critical Wabash condition. And about 20 years ago, 40, a friend of mine who did not have the opportunity to pursue higher education asked me what the greatest lesson was that I had learned in college. A score of years, 2 scores of years later, and 3 degrees later, my answer is the same. College continues to teach me that the world is not black and white, that things I once thought to be simple are actually very complicated. And to be honest, I am not always certain that this has been a helpful lesson. But once the genie of the critical thinking is let loose, I'm afraid it's difficult to shove her back in the bottle. We learn here that we must think outside the box, we think critically, and we think creatively. A lesson that I did not learn in college is that there comes a time to do something more active than thinking. It takes great wisdom to know just when to move from thinking to acting. I'm not sure that I'm in possession of this wisdom any more than the next person. I do know that we are living in a time in which we ought to give close consideration to our critical thinking, our acting, with regards to our place as Americans in the world. And I'm here today not to ask you to think in any particular way about war and peace, past or present. I am here to ask you to sincerely think critically about these matters. So there are a couple of parts of my talk today. First, I wish to entertain you with some interesting stories, and that's most of it. I have gleaned in this my researches in Wabash history in the archives, which relate to times of war. Among these will be stories of Wabash men who have risked paying the ultimate price, as well as men who have questioned the wisdom of war. I should mention that these stories were gathered from various sources, especially oral histories from living alums, some of whom are no longer living, and documents that reside in the archives of our Lilly Library. I'm indebted to our archivist, Joanna Herring, couple archivists back, and to Senior Mike Krasnodębski, who wrote a fine paper on the Civil War in Wabash. And secondly, as a series of wartime stories from the 19th century to the present, I will turn to some thoughts I have regarding our present situation, which was 20 years ago, and in some ways is not that different. I hope to show that the history of Wabash and her tradition of critical thinking can be helpful to us in this emotional and confusing historical moment. I welcome further conversation afterwards, here or in any venue that seems appropriate. This is before Wally's was created, but Wally's would be a good place. So let's talk. Wabash men have a long history of serving our nation militarily. Many living and deceased Wallies fought bravely in wars since the Mexican War of 1846 to 48. One of the first was the famous Lew Wallace, a student at Wabash and veteran of the Mexican War. Records of other Wabash men in the Mexican War are harder to come by, but we do know that Mr. Wallace helped establish the Montgomery Guards, a group of Crawfordsville men in the years prior to the Civil War. In 1858, the College Cadet Company was formed at Wabash and actually drilled with the Montgomery Guards in 1860, a very early town gown event of great importance. The college chroniclers stress less that the faculty, many of whom are educated in abolitionist New England, were exclusively pro-union and especially verbal in their denunciation of slavery. And this story has changed a little bit since the Blackburn research of Dr. Lake, by the way, which I appreciate. In fact, one African-American student was admitted to Wabash prior to the Civil War, which raised many eyebrows. I wrote that 20 years ago, and now the research has really told us a lot more. Numerous Wabash students did enlist on the Union side, including 6 of the 7 graduates of the class of 1862. Among the Wabash students who enlisted was Benjamin Mills, son of our very first professor. At the age of 18, he became an officer of a so-called Color Regiment, the Corps d'Afrique. Interestingly, his Civil War belongings are still held in the college archive. I hope that's still true. Along with these are found some letters to his father, which no doubt kept the Wabash community informed of his activities. These letters speak of daily life in war-torn Virginia, battered buildings, worn and smelly shoes, the prevalence of disease. Son Benjamin also comments on the bravery of the troop of African Americans, who in other documents were lamentably described as lazy and insolent, unfortunately. Young Benjamin took ill and recovered, returned home in 1865. There he completed his education, became a medical doctor, but tragically died before his time, 1868. On a personal note, I now understand the inscription on the volume of Columbus that I found in our very own library that belonged to Caleb Mills' alcove that was dedicated to his son in 1868. Which I think they've gone and put that in the archive for safekeeping, I think. So a couple of alums, Paige Stevens, class of 65, and the very well-known John Pachter of 71, reminded me of a famous story from the memoirs of Vice President Thomas R. Marshall, who was a Wabash student during Reconstruction. Marshall is perhaps best known for his statement, "What this country needs is a good 5-cent cigar." A lesser-known fact is that while he was a student here, he was leader of the College Democrats, a group which he said numbered 7 or 8 members. As side note, how little things have changed. Sorry, 20 years ago as in the present. In Marshall's day as a Wally, the military training program was still in place, one that, led by one of the superfluous officers left over after the conflict between the states, Colonel Henry Carrington. Marshall writes, and I love this story, that the colonel was an old-style Army officer who demanded periodic drills of his cadet students, like ROTC students, essentially, ROTC students. This amounted to dragging a cannon around campus, which got to be a real nuisance as the weather heated up. One day, Marshall was selected as the mule to pull the business end of the cannon. He writes, "We pranced off in the canyon, caissons and everything else, piled the whole mess on what is now the Big 4 railroad running through the corner of campus behind the football stadium, by the way, and we mutinied. A train came in and was compelled to stop." This landed him in the dean's office, or whatever version of that was, right? The train crew and most of the passengers got off, and everything was said, from impropriety to profanity, to induce us to remove the barrier, but we were adamant. Finally, the crew and the passengers cleared the track, and the train went on its way. The next morning, we were drawn up before the faculty, and the dean, I imagine, and I was selected to make the defense. It was brief and to the point, and consisted of the statement that my father had sent me to Wabash College to take, if possible, the asinine traits out of my character. How's that going for you? Not to make more mulish than I already was. Thus, the future vice president rebelled against the military, and one day would be a heartbeat from becoming the commander-in-chief. He was the vice president to Woodrow Wilson. There's another vice president that went to a school down south, but we're not going to talk about him. Several Wabash students enlisted in the war effort against Spain in 1898. Fred Hurt, class of 1898, left Wabash early, enlisting as a medic in the 157th Regiment of Indiana Volunteers. This Waynetown native found himself in Camp Thomas, Georgia, writing home that the press was not properly informing the public about the war. The papers say that health is improving. It's not. It's not true. When I first came here there were 75 in the hospital. Now there are 125. As he was getting ready to leave for Cuba, Fred wrote a letter home to his fiancée warning her to stay away from the shifty, that is, non-Wabash men, in his absence. As it turns out, this was his last letter. Like many of his patients, Fred died of typhoid fever, a victim of the war, falling outside of the battle. World War I brought new and unpredictable challenges, thanks to the explosion of weapons technology and global politics. Wabash men prepared to meet the challenge. In fact, so many men were enlisting for a while that the future of college itself was worrisome. In 1916, the faculty voted unanimously to begin military training. The Wabash Army Training Corps, WATC, was established in 1918 to integrate academic and military needs. There was an office on the ground floor of Center Hall for the commandant, and regular drills took place on the college mall. The influenza epidemic hit Wabash in the fall of 1918, and many of the recruits were quarantined. Once again, the outside community joined with the college, as seen in the donation of new linens from the residents of the town of Newmarket. The WATC was disbanded in 1919, and the college sold off provisions and materials from the barracks to the highest bidder. But there's a cool couple of documents that came out of this war. One was an interesting poem that was published in the Wabash in 1917. Here's a few of the lines. Awake, have pacifists drugged you? Don't be as drones. While the world is at war, as kings lose their thrones, can you sit idle, watching men of your kind be equipped for the trenches in body and mind? Listen, for years you have studied, now a diplomat is sought, to right this destruction cunning rulers have wrought. Can you not devise plans that will work in uniting all nations, Jew, Christian, and Turk, that will save your land from a war's devastation? Converge every ruler under one legislation. Quick, offer your mind and your body and heart. Your nation is at stake. Come do your part. One Wabash man who took that call was Walter A. Snyder, class of 1917. His letter home from a military hospital near London, which I use when I teach History 102, appeared in the Wabash. That Wabash was the Bachelor back in the day. After tantalizing his readers with some tasty stories about slipping out to visit the odd pub for a pint, he relates his tale from that tipsy-turvy hot shop known as the Somme. Listen to his words. We attacked. We went forward 600 yards and came to grips in Fritz's slimy trench. I was the bombing party, society note, and got mine when a German threw a grenade at me. The thing by all rights should have killed me because it went off at my feet, but I must be too tough. I had already accounted for 3 of them during that morning, so I felt as hard as Jesse James. That explosion made Walter a different lad. The nasty thing peppered me, and all day while I lay in that shallow little pipsqueak hole with the whiz-bangs and shrapnel trying to keep me warm, imagine the trench, right? and the rain trying to freeze me, I did some tall thinking. There were 4 of us in that miserable little niche, but we all got out alive when night came, when the machine guns and the snipers knocked off for the day. 2 of our little gathering were plucked in the legs by their bullets. We had to drag one man out because his leg had been shot away. I was cut pretty badly about the head and face, but the wounds in my legs will heal for now, a very short time. I'll be back to the front before long now. Walter Snyder did some serious thinking while lying in no man's land, waiting for the shooting that day. Here at Wabash, 20 years ago, 25% of us in a course called Cultures and Traditions, some of you may remember, we read another account of an ordinary young man, one stationed in Fritz's Trench, as portrayed by Remark in All Quiet on the Western Front. That soldier, Paul, had enlisted to defend his fatherland, but rethought his position after he had seen the horrors of war. War changes people. Walter changed in the wake of that grenade. And sorry to say, I'm not really sure what became of Walter. I've learned a little bit in the last 20 years, but I still don't completely know. There's more research to be done. As you may know, many of you know, World War I was a tragic moment for humanity, and its message resolution left open the door for another world war. As can be gathered by commemorative plaque in Center Hall, numerous Wabash men still there served in World War II. This war produced its fair share of interesting stories, many of which have no doubt improved over the years. That's what stories do. And here's a choice one, which I think may have improved over the years, from General Earl Johnson, class of 1938. And it's a little long, but it's entertaining. It was Friday, April 13th, 1945. Not a very auspicious occasion to be over Tokyo, Japan, in a B-29 on a night fire raid at 2:30 in the morning. I was with a new B-29 crew on their first mission to Japan, and as an instructor pilot in B-29s, I was the co-pilot seat just in case something happened over the target to this crew. Little did I know what was in store for us. As we approached Tokyo from the south, our airplane was caught in searchlights from the ground. This was not unusual, but I should have felt better if the searchlights had not caught us. In less than a minute after that, we were lit up. The airplane shook a little, and there was a little blue flash on the left wing. The left gunner said he thought we had been hit. Just seconds after there was another blue flash on the left wing, and the airplane shook a little. We had been hit again, and some of the crew thought we should bail out. I told everyone in the intercom to shut up, as we were on a bomb run and less than 1 minute from bomb release. Then all hell broke loose. Glass from the glass nose of the B-29 started flying around the cockpit. The bombardier stood up and yelled he was hit and was dying. I got the regular crew co-pilot to tackle him off the cockpit throttles and drag him back to the floor behind me. We still had 30 seconds or so to go before the bomb release on Tokyo, and we were still flying straight and level. Finally, the radar operator said we were over the release point, and so I released the firebombs. At this time, I will never know what got into me, but I said it almost out loud. Those guys are not going to get this little giant. Wabash always fights. Here I was in a very bad situation, and all I could think of was a Wabash slogan that I had been out of Wabash for 6 years. And he still says, I still say to this day, Wabash always fights is why I'm here telling about that incident 57 years after it happened. John Pachter reminds me that not only Wabash students or alumni went to war. In 1943, President Sparks went to Wabash to work in the war effort, and Byron Trippett, the dean and assistant professor of history, went on leave to serve in the Navy. English professor Walt Fertig and several other faculty and staff also went into service in World War II. Let's fast forward to the 60s. Numerous alumni provided me with stories from the Vietnam era. As might be expected, not all of these were appreciative of the war effort. I heard from Philip M. Coons, class of 67, who remembers a teach-in that was put on by the Wabash faculty in 1963 or 1964. This is common on campus, as you may know. Many of the viewpoints expressed favored the war. And Dr. Coons notes that in the end, a vote was taken. I was disappointed to observe that the faculty voted for the war. It's hard to imagine that today, but Dr. Coons remembers trying to understand his political science and history professor's explanation of the domino theory, which was active then, 63, 64. He felt that as a Div 1 major, he could not understand the logic of this theory and suggested to me that this level of analysis may have returned as a pretext to our pursuit of Saddam Hussein, which is something that's coming up in this period that I was talking about. So now I'm headed into a section of this talk which is interesting to me because I'm going to quote a colleague of mine, Bill Blaker, class of 1970, and I want to tell you that I have a colleague who is also class of 1970 who teaches here, whose name I'm not going to say, but he has a birthday only once every 4 years, and today is the day, February 29th. So if you happen to see the professor, who sometimes is confused for me for reasons that I don't really know, we have stories. Say happy birthday to him. But his classmate, Bill Blaker, was involved in this next section. This is the commencement address from 1970. And this is right on the heels of Kent State, which, if you haven't heard, was a big turning point in how people felt about the Vietnam War. A lot of people were on the fence, and after the Kent State killings, they changed their mind about it. Anyway, as is well known in Wabash, in lieu of inviting some overpaid celebrity to preach to our students about what they need to know as they enter the real world, the college quite wisely turns this over to 2 students each May at commencements. Right? This particular year, an address was offered out here on the lawn by one Bill Blaker, William C. Blaker, and my colleague was there as a student. Who went on to a brilliant career at a fine liberal arts college somewhere in the Midwest. I can't imagine where. Bill Blaker is arguably, he was alive when this speech was being taken, was arguably the most respected man of his generation. And currently, or at that point, held the title of Lafayette Distinguished Professor, and that's one of many honors. He stood in this space 3 weeks before my last time I gave this speech and reminisced that it had never been fully to explain to him why we fought in the Vietnam War, nor was it clear to him as a concerned Christian why we were pursuing our current path. And there's some quotations from his 1970 speech that may still have resonance. And this speech is, of course, now published and I'm pretty sure read in EQ, if not elsewhere. But at this point, when I gave this talk, it was not published, actually. So this is the words of Blaker. So the other thing I got to tell you is, as I was getting to this point of this speech, it was a beautiful day out. Even though it was late February, it was like a few days ago where it was sunny and nice out, and these doors back here were open. I had a larger crowd looking at me, but a good crowd looking at me like here, as I'm about ready to utter these words. And as I'm quoting from his speech, who should walk in the frickin' door? But Bill Blaker, right back there. I can never forget that, even though it was 21 years ago. And he stood there with the biggest shit-eating grin. And I think, and I had to think, like, do I say, hey, here's Bill Blaker, or do I keep on with my talk? And I just kept on with the talk. I don't know if that was the right thing to do or not, even to the president. But as I get to this point in the talk, I'm feeling like he's back there. I'm just going to say, right? So in 1950, as you may know, he died in December 2008. In 1955, the Secretary of State assured the American people, this is his words in his commencement address, that within a year or two, the communist threat in Vietnam would have ended. In 1955. But in 1963, the Secretary of Defense promised the American advisors in Vietnam would be home by Christmas. A year later, Lyndon Johnson was elected president on the promise that the American boys would not have to fight a war for Asians. 4 years later, Richard Nixon was elected president on a promise to end the war in Vietnam. A year and a half after that, the first boys were killed in Cambodia. I might add that Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger went on to mount a massive secret bombing campaign, this is Warner speaking, in Cambodia and afterwards. Young Bill Placo continued, I do not ask that all of you share my viewpoint. I think that's a very important statement. Only that you try to understand the experience behind it. And I like this sentence. Surely it is possible to be patriotic and hate what's happening to the country you love. Perhaps to hate a war, not out of communism or anarchism, but because it's killing your friends to no good purpose. Still, in this time of pestilence, Mr. Plaker argued, it is easy to see only the negative side of life. Listen to the words of Camus. There are more things to admire in men than despise. Mr. Plaker's speech ends in a hopeful note. The class of 1970 does not enter a world full of nothing but glorious opportunities, but perhaps we'll learn there are more things to admire in men than to despise. Perhaps it will never be enough to change the world. We will act honorably than we would expected we would. Perhaps we'll have a lot of fun along the way. It wouldn't be a bad life. Within the past few weeks, in 2003, I've had two President's Day soldiers in my office. One was John Ashton, who interrupted his Wabash career to serve as part of a peacekeeping force in Bosnia. John mused that he may have learned as much as anyone else might on a more traditional off-campus studies program, more immersion trip, which we didn't have then. He guarded mosques, collected weapons from civilians. He served a unit that was made up primarily of men of color. He suggested his reflections from this last fact are an indication of how far he has come since he left the southern Indiana for Wabash. We should all be thankful for John's service. A few days later, I found myself talking to Jesus Campos, who told me that he and Nicolin Cooper were being called up. Jesus was in his last semester here. He's a fine Wabash student, the one in his family, first one in his family not only to go to college, but also to complete high school. As I told Jesus, vaya con Dios, and not foreign to my stomach that I might not see him again. I did. At that moment, I decided I need to inform myself about the military situation as best as I could. Now, this military situation, I had to actually look up to find out which year we're talking about. It was the beginnings of the invasion of Iraq. So like the young Bill Plaker, I do not seek to change your view about the current military situation, and I still don't. We are all educated adults here who must answer these questions for ourselves. However, I'm interested in speaking about appropriate ways that Wabash can respond to war with respect to our unique campus culture. We're a family. We can agree to disagree, but we must respect the rights and persons of everyone in our community. Vengeful emails and cynical one-liners have no place in Wabash discourse. It is possible to be very patriotic and opposed to war. It is possible to be very patriotic and in favor of war. There are many things to admire in men, in people, more than there are to despise, as Bill Plaker would have us believe. He thinks there are more. At Wabash, our mission is to teach men, and ourselves, I'd add, to think critically, act responsibly, live humanely, and lead effectively. Let me briefly engage these important points with an eye to the current situation. Think critically. In history, we encourage students to think critically by knowing the limitations of their sources, one of which you're hearing right now, both primary and secondary. The perspective of the author is not the only factor in weighing the value of the document, but becoming aware of the perspective is a critical tool for the analysis, the context. Thinking critically about where you are getting your information. Now this line I love. Turn off your TV. That's just a little dated. I should be like, turn off your social media, right? I don't know. Does anybody really watch TV news anymore? I don't know. But it's the same thing, silence that puppy. Above all, do not get obsessed with the video game graphics like so many viewers did during the last Gulf War. Did we see images of real people being bombed? that would be a different perspective, as Walter and Paul would attest. But read a variety of print sources, right? I would still say that. I suggest reading the news on a Canadian broadcast website because they're out of the wicket of this, right? Unlike the Canadians, U.S. media tend to present a homogenized view. That's changed. It's like this now, right? But they're homogenized on two sides. Not that the view's always wrong, but the various networks tend to mimic or now mimic and disagree with one another. I sat during this previous election in a Little Giants room with college Republicans and Democrats watching each network put Florida in the Gore column and then take it out, because they're they're mimicking each other, right? It was entertaining, but in a way it wasn't. So I repeat, turn off your television. Besides the press, we need to be skeptical of the government. That's not a very hard case to make to most of you, I think. I hope, here's the libertarian place that we are. I hope that you do not find it a radical notion that our elected officials, on occasion, will conceal the truth from us. This can be blatant, as in the case was during the Cambodian invasion, which was true, it happened that way, or subtle, as in the underreporting of certain things, right? Unlike like any other source, government pronouncements need to be taken critically. That's part of our skill set. Part of critical thinking is that takes us outside of our comfort zone. What do we know about Iraq, or what do we know about anywhere, right? And as citizens, we should know about, what should we know about it, right? The world does not seem to understand us, for probably good reason. While many of our opponents may be complete idiots, there may have been some reasonable criticisms of our behavior of our nation, right? We need to think critically about this. Again, read foreign sources, some of which are translated into English. Read broadly, right? Is war inevitable? Will it work? Toward what goal? What are other people thinking? Right? It seems to me this is advice that's still pretty good 21 years later. Next bullet point, act responsibly. Do your comments about the military situation invite discussion, or do it close it down? Can the gentleman's rule help us maintain civil discourse? I hope so, in a time of pestilence. Respect the opinions of others. Colonel Stan Walker, a Vietnam vet and one-time director of alumni affairs, reminded me in a recent phone conversation that there are days in which we would do well to remember that in the Wabash community, we have differences. In fact, I've got some with him. But we also have strong common beliefs. Let's focus on these bonds. Next bullet point, live humanely. Consider yourself a global citizen. During the Vietnam period, war deaths were frequently counted in terms of American lives. Every day at the end of Walter Cronkite's, those of you who are old enough to remember Walter Cronkite, he would say how many Americans lost their lives in Vietnam that day, right? Nearly 56,000 people died in Vietnam. Man, that number's off by several 100,000, though, if we count Asians, right? So war may be necessary or not, but it is a tragedy for families on both sides. I don't like the word to use the word collateral damage if it's going to refer to human beings. To me, that's an obscenity. Lead effectively. It is important to investigate matters fully. There comes a time, however, when action is required. As the World War I poem states, for years you have studied, now a diplomat is sought. Or a soldier. Effective leadership presumes wisdom, but also courage. Perhaps courage to speak out when others disdain your views. For some of us, this may entail going into the streets, exercising our First Amendment rights. Shortly after Mr. Plaker's graduation, many Americans did that. Many people were in the streets across the world the previous weekend from this talk. True leadership requires vision and action. And as the Jesuit priest Phil Berrigan said in the 1970s, the time has passed when good men may be silent. Wabash men throughout the ages have faced military realities with courage and wisdom. In the days ahead, it is my fond hope that you will carry this tradition forward as you think critically, act responsibly, live humanely, and live effectively. In war as in peace, Wabash always fights. Thank you.